Welcome, everyone, to the XojoTalk podcast. I am Paul Lefebvre, the Xojo developer evangelist. And in this episode, I have special guest Kimball Larsen. Kimball has been a Xojo developer for quite a while now, and a software developer for about 15 years or so. Kimball, thank you for joining me on XojoTalk.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, I like to start off my guests by putting them on the spot and asking them to just give a little bit of background of how they started developing and how they started using Xojo.
Well, the kind of condensed version is I was a poor broke college student once upon a time, these many years ago. And I have a brother who was in chiropractic school, and he approached me with an idea for a project that required a little software engineering to happen. And he wanted to know if I knew a way to do it. And I had a couple of different ideas, but one of his big requirements was it's got to be cross-platform. I've got to be able to sell this to people on Mac and Windows. And at the time, this was back in the real basic 4 days.
That would have been like 2002 or 3, maybe.
Yeah, 2000, late 2001 was when he first approached me, and we started on it in 2002, I believe. Yeah. So, surveying the market to see what tools were available that would, produce cross-platform stuff, I found Real Basic, and have been using it ever since.
Awesome. It's a similar time frame to a lot of people, is around the early 2000s when seem to have discovered the tool and have been using it for ever since then.
Yep.
That's right about the time when I started using it, actually. It was late 2001, early 2002. Right after I had switched to Mac, when I found Real Basic at the time and started using it.
I see. So you've seen the light.
I've seen the light. Yeah. Well, everyone knows my history of, a longtime Windows developer, .NET developer, and then, just kind of said, this is all crap. I'm switching Xojo all the time, 100%. All Xojo, nothing but Xojo. And it makes me a happier person now.
Oh, that's good.
So what sort of stuff do you build with Xojo these days?
Well, the main product that I build is called AcuGraph, and it is an acupuncturist and chiropractic aid that is used to diagnose acupuncture-y stuff. And if you want me to get into all the technical stuff of that, I can, but that's the main thing I do. It's a flagship product of my company where I work here, and that's where I spend 90% of my Xojo time is spent in the AcuGraph source space. It's a pretty large application. I counted up the source code a few weeks ago, actually, and it was somewhere north of 75,000 lines of code at this point. We've gone through 5 major releases of it. And the most recent one is got a heavily dependent on some cloud-based infrastructure that I built, so everything's all distributed, and Xojo's at the core of all of it. So
nice. So how long has this software been around, I guess?
This was actually when my brother approached me, the idea he had was for this software. And so it's been around since 2002 or 3 when we released the first version.
Oh, so you've been continuing to work on that ever since, adding stuff to it?
Yeah.
Now, this is used by other offices as well? You sell it,
so
or is it...
we actually don't practice any acupuncture or chiropractic here. We develop this for the acupuncture market, and that's who we sell it to. So we sell it worldwide, and we've got thousands of customers, thousands of users. And it's used in your acupuncture practice. If you go and see an acupuncturist, some of the listeners may have before, and they may have had the acupuncturist graph them. That's kind of the nomenclature they use. Let me do a graph on you and see what you're looking like. And if they have ever been graphed by an acupuncturist, that's my software.
Cool. I think we have a show title right there. So that's pretty neat. So you get to do that stuff full time. So what sort of supplemental type things does Xojo use in conjunction with this? You're working with a database. You mentioned cloud stuff that you're relying on.
Yeah, so I've used Xojo to talk to lots of different things. So I've interacted with MySQL databases. Usually that's when I'm doing a quick one-off thing where I need to parse some things and organize it well. Quick and dirty is just throw that into MySQL. But most of the time I'm using the embedded SQLite. And now that I've gone distributed, I'm actually using the really fantastic kubesql server, which allows me to have SQLite instances on the cloud. And the reason that's important for us is because we can encrypt them. And since we're using medical patient data, HIPAA compliance is real important for us. And so finding something that would encrypt the data on the servers was difficult, and kubesql fit that really nicely. So in order to glue all of that together, I'm using PHP instead of the web components from Xojo for a number of reasons that I can get into if you're interested. But I've written a nice little PHP front-end web service thing that Xojo talks to, and it keeps all my data organized in the kubesql server.
Well, that's good. I mean, we always like to see Xojo work in conjunction with other tools. So it's not like bad that you made a PHP thing that Xojo communicates with. That's a good thing. Hey, yeah. Xojo can talk to PHP and pretty much anything else. And, you use what is appropriate for what you're trying to build to get the task done. And Xojo kind of connects up to all those components. Certainly, I've been doing a lot of webinars and stuff recently showing people how to use Xojo to do that web service layer in Xojo itself, and that's helpful for people that don't necessarily know PHP and don't want to have to go learn it.
Right, sure.
All right, so you've been doing that for quite a while now. Are you professionally trained as a software developer, or is this kind of something where, you said your brother had approached you and you're like, I'm going to look into this? Or
Yeah, so he approached me while I was finishing my computer science degree. So I do have a BS in computer science, and so I'm trained in all of that kind of thing. And my degree was much more theoretical, as BSs in CS generally tend to be. But I do find that a lot of the things that I've focused on and learned in school have been directly applicable. Mostly the ability to figure out stuff on my own more than anything. That's what I got from my degree. But the heavy reliance on object orientation and good design patterns also has been huge in being able to be successful as a developer on a long-term project that's serving thousands of people. To be able to do that and to do it right really does require a lot of that theoretical background, and Xojo thankfully has made that possible. Though I do recall the dark days of the early Real Basics when I started. There were some head scratching moments, I got to admit, when I once tried to pass an array as an argument to a method, and you couldn't do that. That was against the rules back then. And,
the original compiler, I don't believe that worked.
Yeah, it sure didn't. And I'm it kind of flummoxed me. How in the world can you possibly convince me that this is a real object oriented thing, and it won't even let me do simple stuff like that. But thankfully, it's massively improved over the years, and now of course you can do all kinds of much more sophisticated techniques. So. Yeah, my degree has really helped for all of that.
Yeah, definitely. The compiler has improved tremendously over the years to be more almost industry standard support for those type of features. You don't have to really worry about oddball behaviors like that. You can just if it's a technique that's commonly used in any object-oriented programming language, well, it's likely to work similarly, if not the same, in Xojo itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree, too, with your statement about, the educational background helping figure stuff out. You see a lot these days, not specifically with Xojo necessarily, but a lot of people, people call themselves programmers, are building stuff using, just almost, by pieces. They get kits or pieces, and they just kind of plug all these things together and, oh, look, I made an app.
And that's it's hard not to laugh when you hear people say, yeah, I'm a programmer. Oh, really? What are you what are you working on? Oh, I put together a website. Well, okay, that's not really programming necessarily. I mean, I kind of, but yeah, it's hard not to step on toes at the same time, and it's hard not to be all hoity-toity uppity at people too. At the same time,
it is a bell. Yeah, certainly HTML. I get all hoity-toity and will tell people HTML is not a programming language. Knock it off. I certainly will do that. But more of other things where people get really dependent. I mean, maybe you saw it in the news recently where, I forget the specific tool. it was, I'm going to think it's something related to like Node or a JavaScript framework or something. But someone who published this popular JavaScript framework, it had a simple method in it.
Oh, I did see that. It's like 13 lines of code and it broke everything.
Yeah, this method did nothing but some string padding, and like it was right adjusted string padding or something like that. Right. And the person who published this library like yanked it or pulled it. I don't remember the specifics, but they yanked it, and this broke projects all over the internet that were just kind of linking into this library, and they were freaking out. And then when you look at this code, it was, I don't even think it was 13 lines of code, Kimball.
Yeah, it was small. It was tiny. I do remember reading that.
But there was a lot of people that were, flummoxed, stumped. Oh no, what their app broke because some really rinky-dink simple library stopped working, and they didn't understand. Maybe they probably understood the code itself, but they didn't really understand how it all came together either. So they kind of, a lot of people were really upset about that, and it started bringing up a lot of conversations on the internet about people, the level of reliance and the heavy kit aspect of a lot of particularly the web type stuff that's out there these days.
Right. I remember the reason I heard that was because I saw somebody published a brand new web service that you could call into that replaced that function. And so instead of having to make the method call into the built-in library function, now you could just do a quick HTTP GET and hand it the string you wanted left padded, and it would respond with the correctly padded string.
Yeah, I saw that. I took it as more of it was making fun of this particular problem and web services all at the same time.
It was.
Which
and
was
great. If you took the time to read the documentation the guy put together, it was hilarious. Don't drink anything while you read it. It'll get all over your monitor.
Yeah, exactly. The thought of making a web service to do string, handling like that is just ridiculous. But But yeah, and of course, the web service itself is probably likely to be less reliable than a package that you pull in somewhere.
Of course.
So yeah, that was just funny. But having that background in education does allow you to kind of step back and think about stuff when you run into an issue.
Yeah, more than anything, I think it lets me be able to know that there are lots and lots of tools to consider when it's time to get a job done. And, it's a common phrase. And one of my professors way back in the day, one of his favorite things to say was, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then the whole world looks like a nail. And his idea there was try not to have only a hammer in your toolbox, because a lot of times the hammer's the wrong tool for the job. If you need to cut a piece of wood in half, a hammer's not going to do a good job. If you need to put a screw, a delicate little screw into, something, a hammer's not going to be the right tool. So more than anything, that education has allowed me to not be focused on the tool, but rather be focused on finding the right solution and developing the correct technique, even if that means I have to develop the tool myself from scratch, which I have had to do.
Right, yeah. Often you have to build your own tools using the tools you use to solve a problem.
Exactly.
And that's a common thing we hear about people using Xojo for, because it's so quick to, throw together an app and get it up and running, that people often end up using Xojo to build a tool that they're then using to solve a completely different problem that they maybe started with.
Yep.
One thing I like to remind people is there's always more than one way to solve a problem with software. Yeah. And that you're saying, of course, but not a lot of people don't think that as of course. They're like, I only know how to do it this one way. And if they run into some difficulty in that one way for one reason or another, completely stumped, don't know what to do. And sometimes you got to be able to back up out of that alley and look again and, try a completely different path, try something a different way and have that confidence that you're still going to end up where you need to be.
Right.
Is if you're relying on the pre-built stuff, it's hard to get that level of confidence because you didn't build that stuff to begin with. And then you're like, oh, is there something else? What am I going to do? Oh no, I'll never get this done. And that never, ever happens. I know when I was doing consulting, my wife was really, really nervous for me to start doing consulting, because I had a .NET, regular job at a company. And she's like, how are you going to build stuff? You never know what you're going to get asked to build. What if you can't build it? And I'm like, I think I'll be able to figure it out.
Yeah, I think that's part of the my favorite part of the challenge is because I also do a lot of consulting on the side, and unfortunately, I can't talk about a lot of the projects I've worked on, but in the consulting stuff, it's a lot. It's fun for me because it gives me a new challenge and a new problem to solve. And I've been, when you work on a project for 12 or 13 years, like I have with AcuGraph, you kind of get entrenched with here's the way it's done, right? And so there is a specific problem set, and I've already solved just about all of it. And so most of the code changes I'm doing now are kind of incremental in nature, and they're just augmenting or adding to what's already there. But the core of what it does, I mean, there's code in my source base that has not changed in 13 years. I wrote it, back then, and it works perfectly, and there's no reason to change it. And so when I do some consulting, that's nice because it gives me a completely new arena to go and play in. And frequently the problems that need to be solved there are vastly different from anything I've ever encountered. And that, I think, is what I enjoy the most about engineering, where being able to come up with unique and elegant solutions to interesting problems, and having Xojo in my tool belt there is phenomenal as far as being able to quickly put together something that is going to prove out that the concept will work. So I do use it rather heavily for proof of concept stuff, and then frequently the client will say, yeah, that looks great, let's put some lipstick on it and publish it, and that's what we do. So yeah, I generally push them towards Xojo. Most people approach me and say, I've got this idea, I've never heard of it before, but when they see how quickly I can get stuff cranked out and how well it works, they're generally very, very happy with the results.
Yeah, that's the same thing I found as well, is when you're doing stuff like that, people care about the results, and they need the tool, they need the app, they need the piece of software to help their business in some way, usually to make them money, keep them going. And if it turns out that you can provide that to them easier, faster, and for them using something like Xojo, they're going to be like, awesome. I got no problem with that. And that definitely is a common thing. I found you didn't want to, come blaring into, conversations with clients or proposals or anything and lay out all this technical stuff right up front, what tools you're using and stuff. It goes over their head. They don't know it. They don't understand it. And it scares them. And so you want to start at the beginning, just taking the time to understand what the heck is it they're trying, what's their problem? And,
and interestingly, not a lot of times I've run across a few clients who I've decided not to work with. And it's because they come from the mindset of they have a little bit of experience with some engineering in the past, and perhaps they used a tool. And so there was one particular client sticking out in my mind who was a former, I don't know if he was a .NET developer or if he was, I don't remember the particular tool that he really knew fairly well, but he had worked using this particular tool for a number of years. But what he wanted to do was beyond his own skill set. And so he wanted somebody else to come and do it, but he wanted them to do it using this particular tool because that's what he knew, right? Never mind, that's the wrong tool for the job, whatever it was. I don't remember the specifics. I just remember thinking, I'm not going to be able to work well with this guy because he's stuck on the hammer and he isn't willing to look in the toolbox to see what else is available that might do a better job. And I think that's important to consider.
Yeah, I definitely had the same boat. I had, remember one client that had a specific architecture they wanted to implement for how something would work. And I didn't think it was the best idea for what they were trying to build. So I proposed an alternative. And they were somewhat receptive. They said, yeah, we think yours is going to work, but we really want to stick with ours. And I said, okay, well, forget it. I'm out. I'm out. I'm building yours. You'll have to find someone else. I think it has too many problems that I'll have to deal with later. And so I was out. And I'm comfortable with that decision because you don't want to just, grab and build everything. It's, you often hear the phrase, the customer is always right. And
except for when they're wrong.
I think there's very few situations when they're always right. I mean, the customer may always be paying you, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're right. And sometimes, you can go down a really bad, dark path if you just, are building everything they want, because
Right.
they might not know what they want, or they may be utterly mistaken. And if you're the expert, it's kind of your job to not really say, hey, you're wrong, do it my way, but to explain to them why an alternative approach might make more sense.
And a lot of times you need to dumb it down an awful lot and try and use analogies. And I like to go to cars because everybody understands cars. So whenever somebody's not understanding something or can't understand why what they're proposing is, we'll call it less optimal, then I'll generally try and think up a quick car analogy. And that usually is pretty effective for helping people understand why what they're proposing is not a great idea.
Yeah, I had a client that had sent me they had written a product that was in .NET, and they wanted a Mac version.
Mm.
And I know .NET pretty well, so sure, I can handle that. And said, why don't you send me your .NET code so I can take a look at it? I'm not necessarily going to port it, but I want to review it, take a look at it. Well, I look at it, and it, I fire up Visual Studio, I click on the project, open it, and it's not opening. Minutes later, the project opened.
Really?
And I'm like, that's really weird. So I start clicking around. It turned out I don't want to say all of it, but almost the entire code was in like whatever the equivalent is to the main method in this
my
project.
Goodness, really?
So it was thousands upon thousands of lines of code in just a single method. Just this procedural blob of code. And, I came back and I said, I can't work with this.
Yeah, no kidding.
I said that this is untenable. I said, what I can do is, build you an all new app that's structured properly and will run on both Mac and Windows, assuming you can provide me the rules for how this app works, and I can, run it to see. And they agreed to that. I ended up building them that, and that's much better. But that was an example of, the customer wasn't adamant, luckily, that, you stick with that. And I think I hopefully apparently did a decent job explaining, why, and probably why they came to me in the first place was, they probably programmed themselves into a corner, so to speak.
Right. Well, yeah, they had. It sounds like, I've gone the other extreme though, sometimes where you're trying to make things so segregated and so separated as far as, components of your app have one job and one job only, and you don't want to either duplicate that job anywhere else. So anything that needs to do that particular job always calls that one component. But I've taken that sometimes to the extreme and had to backtrack, where I've had, a chain 16 or 18 methods deep where, I just kept breaking it up and breaking it up and breaking it up to the point that it was just kind of silly that I only had one entry point for one method and it had to call 16 more in a straight line. It would call B and B would call C and C would call D, even though there was nothing else using B, C, and D anywhere. And so
right.
I have gone the other direction, where instead of sticking it all in one, I try and stick one line of code in millions of methods, and it gets to be a headache as well.
Yeah, that certainly would be the polar opposite, and also not really a great design pattern either, because then you invented your own programming language.
Kind of, yeah.
That no one else could ever use. I remember there was a company I worked with. We were using a tool called Power Builder at the time, and we had this so-called framework for building the GUI of the app, and I don't remember, it was designed by the senior level dudes. I was a youngin' fresh out of school at the time, and they had built this app that was kind of database based, so it would load up some of the UI structure from the database, and so like you'd list in the database the specific windows that were in the app, and it would read through that and create a window, and then it would map to a database table and show the data in the table, and it was really weird. And it worked okay, but it was weird. I mean, tried debugging through this, because
no way.
You end up debugging into the framework every time, and then debugging through database calls to figure out what it's reading from the table, and then what other window it's actually going to open. It was kind of a nightmare. And the architecture team eventually, I'm trying to think about how to properly phase it. At the time, we were not making great use of what would be considered classes in Xojo. In Power Builder, they had a different name that's escaping me at the moment. but we weren't making a great use of the classes. And I came in and I said, we really ought to start moving some of this business logic out of the UI windows and whatnot and put it into classes. Non-visual objects, that's what they were called in Power Builder. And
okay. Non-visual objects.
Yeah, exactly. Why do I have such a strange name? And so I proposed that to the architecture team, and thinking at the time, okay, just use classes. Well, they had to come up with an architecture to use the classes. So They came up with a database method to call stuff in the classes. So you would have to populate tables in the app. And then when you clicked on a button, it would look up the button in the database, look up what method that button should call in the database, go back to the framework, figure out where that method was, instantiate the class. Oh my God. It was awful. I don't think I lasted.
You've just described purgatory as far as I'm concerned.
I think I did not last there much longer after that, because I was like, I can't deal with this. This is just crazy. And it was an amazing technical feat, though, I guess is probably where I'm going with my story. But it was just unusable.
Yeah. Wow. I learned model view controller approaches. I don't even remember when I first ran across it. I think I was still in school. And that seems so logical and clean. And to this day, that's how I organize things. Even in my Xojo apps, I will, instead of putting code into the window, I consider that to be the view more than anything. And so I will almost always write backing classes that are the controllers, and anything a window needs to do, it calls into the controller to do it. Any logic, any business logic that needs to happen. And then of course, all the data lives in a database layer that, keeps segregated. There's never logic in the database. That's a cardinal sin, if you ask me.
Well, don't go down that path with people that love their stored procedures, though.
Stored procedures, when you're manipulating the data directly, there is a time and place for that, of course. But, if you want to update the contents of a label, perhaps in a window that's far flung somewhere in the app, the database darn well better not be doing that. That's got to live in an application controller somewhere. So.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to have stuff split like that. And of course, the practical benefit for people that, you're like, oh, well, that's all hoity-toity, The benefit is if you've got your stuff split like that, well, then when it comes time to maybe make a web version of your desktop app or an iOS version, you've already got that, controller code isolated out. And It allows you to just you can focus then on the UI for this other platform, and then maybe very easily hook it up to the controllers you've already built and sharing the code that way.
Yep. Now, I have found myself falling into the pitfalls where you start a quick little proof of concept to get something up on the screen so that the client can see it and interact with it. And in those, when you're working so quickly, I do tend to just throw it all into the window and just, I'll come back later and clean it up. And I like to think that I do come back later and separate those things out, but I'll be honest, sometimes I just don't. And that's okay, and it works fine. But when I'm going to be designing something that I know either other people are going to be touching or is going to need to stick around for a long time, I do try and be pretty strict about MVC compliance that way.
Well, it's a tipping point thing. I mean, you hear about it referred to often as like technical debt, where, you can take the fast way to build something really quickly. And that has its benefits. You built it quickly. It's fast. It didn't cost as much money. It didn't take as much time. But if it turns out that becomes something you're relying on for a really long time, or it becomes mission critical, it often is worth, paying back that technical debt and going back and fixing those things. But, a lot of places won't. They'll just leave it and, just keep, adding on stuff. And then you end up with the house with the crappy foundation. And then eventually, it's a nightmare where no one wants to be on that team, no one wants to work on that project, and that's not, you don't want to.
You try and build more and more stories onto the house, and eventually it tips over.
Yeah, so and that's tricky, and going back and fixing it while the app is live and in production. I mean, that can be a challenging and maybe fun, but it also can be a disaster for the people trying to use it.
Right, of course. Over the history of AcuGraph, the main product I work on, the first release of that thing was very primitive. It was just barely enough to prove to the market that we could actually do what needed to be done. And then when it came time to put out version 2, there were a bunch of new features we wanted to add. And I wound up having to go back and rewrite or reorganize at least 80% of the first version's code base. So AcuGraph 2 came out and things were lots more organized and cleaner. And that made the transition to 3 quite a bit better because I had, at that point, separated everything out pretty strictly and had business all in one spot and all of the display in another spot and all of the database in a third. And then over the history of other releases with 4 and then 5 eventually, I think I've rewritten almost the entire application at least twice now. And not necessarily rewritten, but certainly reorganized. There are, like I mentioned earlier, there are some kind of holy classes that will never be touched again, that they are where they are and they're never going to be touched. They've been there for 13 years. And at this point, I'm too afraid to ask kind of what's going on inside that method. But yeah, it's an iterative process whenever you've got a long-term project, and being able to iterate effectively does require a good tool. And Xojo does provide that, thankfully. And it has gotten better at doing that and being a good scaffolding or architecture to let me be able to organize things effectively. And that's been a grateful, welcome thing for me.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the first versions you would have used wouldn't have even had the ability to work easily with source control.
No,
which
no.
which is something you absolutely need when you've got projects of this scale, because you have to have the trust that, if you screw something up, you can go back to what worked, or
right.
you can, split your code essentially, or do a branch as they call it, or something like that.
Right,
so you
branches
can,
and forks and stuff, right?
Leave the working branch alone. Don't monkey with it. Set up a new one where you're experimenting and testing. And if you completely hose it there, the people relying on the current working version aren't going to be, messed up should you have to go and fix something there. So stuff like that.
Back when I started, it was all CVS was our source control. And that's what I was using. I built my own CVS Linux box. Yeah, I had a Linux box in my house. And so I set that up as a CVS repository. And that's what I was checking anything and everything into. And that worked as far as snapshotting the code, but it was not effective for being able to diff what I'd done. And so if I ever made a mistake, I had to just check out the whole project again into a new repository and figure out what I'd done differently, and then trying to compare things. And it was a nightmare. So thankfully, things are a lot better now with both with Git and the source control friendliness of more recent Xojo projects. It's really been helpful.
Yeah, I remember CVS. That was.
I bet it's not a fond memory.
No, I'm trying to. I mean, back I started coding professionally in the early '90s, and at the time we weren't using any sort of source control. I mean,
oh man,
that was not a common thing back then.
Right.
And I remember we would, have files that were renamed, old or stuff like that, and it was just, it's stuff you still see people do today that aren't experienced with source control or don't feel they have the need for it. But, we used to do that back in the 90s. And then we had added a source control system, MKS Source Integrity. I have no idea if they're still around or anything, and I don't know why that
never even heard of that one.
Yeah, I don't even know. I don't even know why that. I still remember that. I got a weird memory for things like that. But I remember we used that one, and it was a locking source tool, unlike pretty much all of them nowadays, where it's anyone can grab anything, and you worry about conflicts when you check in. This one, when you went to check something out, it would actually put a physical lock on it. Maybe the Microsoft Visual Source Safe did that.
Yeah, I think it did, but yeah.
Which was, so I kind of got used to that pattern of working, as did the team. So you'd be like, oh, I can't check that out. Paul has that. And so you'd be, goof off the rest of the day or something. I don't know. But find something else to work on. And but then when we had to switch to CVS, the team still wanted that locking.
No, really?
And CVS does not, if I remember properly, does not want to work that way.
No, I think CVS is very much resolve conflicts on check-in.
Yeah,
And
that's my
that
memory.
pattern it persisted through Subversion as well. And yeah, thank goodness for Git. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, so I remember, I seem to recall some awful times where maybe we even tried to make CVS do a lock on checkout rather than a merge on commit kind of method. I don't.
Wow.
I think I've successfully blocked those memories though, because I can't recall exactly what we did. But
you're in recovery there. That's great.
yeah, I'm in recovery. But eventually, we switched to using Microsoft's Team Foundation server, which was quite nice if you're using Microsoft's tool sets and whatnot. But these days, Git is it, as Justin Elliott once told me, and I tend to like that little quote.
Yep, that's a good
one. Use Git, and I still use Subversion a lot as well. And I've used that one the longest at this point, so I'm more comfortable with it. Git is definitely it, but I also find Git to be, it can get overwhelming. It's got a lot of stuff in it, and the tools for it generally they can be also overwhelming with, they expose all the features or something like that, and it's just like, wow. And what you were describing too about your first version of AcuGraph, that's another term you hear people throw about, the minimally viable product, where you want to just kind of build the least amount of thing that you can get out there to show people you can, one, build this will work. This will, it won't do everything that you need necessarily, but it's a start. And Xojo can be great for people that are looking to do that, because you can quickly bang something out to show people. And that's important. I've worked at a lot of companies where, I was using the so-called required tool set. I mentioned Power Builder, Visual Studio. I still use Xojo or Real Basic or whatever it was back at the time. And I still used it often to prototype something. We'd get a spec down from, the business analyst. I might mock it up in Xojo first, just to sit with them after and say, this is what you're thinking, rather than attempt to shoot, especially when I had that crazy framework I was dealing with, rather than attempt to go through all that work to shoehorn it into, whatever slower methodology it was for creating the app. This could be a great way to demonstrate stuff. And I even built many internal utilities that ended up just being kept that way, that just were used because they worked. Right. Actually ran into someone at was it last week or the week before? I went to a local agile software development meeting, and I ran into someone I worked with about 15 years ago, and we were chatting. Oh, really? And he was asking what I'm doing. I said, I do this stuff at Xojo now. And he's like, are you still making those great utilities? And he rattled off the name of a utility I had made that he was like, that was the best thing ever. And I only remember the name because I had called it Spew, because I like to make silly names for things. And it was called Spew because it was an acronym, SPU, for Stored Procedure Utility.
Okay.
And we were working with Oracle. I don't remember exactly what the tool did anymore. But obviously something related to stored procedures, but
obviously something this guy liked a lot. Yeah.
And he was like, that made my life so much easier. I'm like, great. I don't remember what it did, but
glad it helped.
Yeah, that was funny because that would have been easily 15 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. Man, how time flies, huh?
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up real quick, I see here on your little list of fun things you like to do is that you like to play with anything that's remote controlled.
I do. Yeah. I've always, since I was a little kid, I've had a fascination with remote control toys and things. And I remember my first remote control car back in the early 80s when I was, short, was the Lobo 2 from Sears. And this was a Christmas present I got. And man, this sucker was incredible. It was a rear wheel drive, kind of buggy style remote control car with the big brick of NiCad batteries. And it was a lot of fun to play with out in the front yard of the house kind of thing. Since then, I've moved on to kind of bigger and better stuff. I now fly RC planes. We've got a lot of big parks around here, and I've got a garage full of planes. And I loved going after work and going to just grab a plane or two and running down to the park and flying for a little while. And I still enjoy remote control cars, and I've even had a boat or two. And so yeah, kind of a fascination with all things RC.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I've never flown a RC plane. I kind of think I might like to. There's a big sports field that's kind of across the way from us that I'll often see people there that show up with their planes, and rockets is another thing. People like to launch those little rockets there. Like, that looks like that'd be pretty cool. Yeah, I've had a lot of remote control cars in my day. I tried to get my son hooked on those, but so far those haven't stuck.
My kids like to come with me to go fly, but mostly because there's a play set there. There's a big playground at the park, and so they'll, you want to come with me to the park? We're going to go fly for a little while, and yeah, that's great. And we all run across the street over to the park, and before you know it, I'm standing in the field all by myself, and the kids are run off on the playground, and everybody's having a good time, so that's fine.
Yep, that's great. All right, well, thank you, Kimball, for this enlightening Xojo talk, as it is. I think we had some grand conversations that hopefully people will enjoy.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed it, and I hope to see a lot of people at the upcoming Xojo conference down in Texas. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, XDC 2016 is in Texas the first week of October. In Houston, Texas, actually. And the show notes will have a list of the sessions, so you can check out sessions at XDC, see what makes sense. We got a lot of new presenters this year and a lot of different sessions. So if you haven't been to XDC recently, might be something there that you're going to find interesting. I know I'm spending a lot of time with my Raspberry Pi trying to come up with a great session on that for everybody.
Yeah, that's one I would love to hear a little bit more about.
All right. Thank you, Kimball.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the time.
Have a great day, everyone.